There are some people in this world who walk through life without making a sound. They sit in the back of classrooms. They eat lunch alone. They pass through hallways like ghosts, and nobody ever stops to wonder who they really are. At Westbrook High School, there was a boy just like that. His name was Theo, and for 17 years, he had mastered the art of being invisible. Theo was the kind of kid that other students looked right through. He wore the same faded jeans most days, rotated between 3 old t-shirts, and carried a backpack that had seen better days. His sneakers had holes near the toes, but he never complained. He never really said much of anything to anyone. That was just how things were for him, and he had accepted it a long time ago. His father worked as a janitor at the same school Theo attended. Every morning, Theo would see his dad pushing a mop down the hallway or emptying trash cans outside the cafeteria. Some kids thought it was funny. They would make jokes when they thought Theo could not hear them. But he always heard. He just never reacted. He had learned early on that reacting only made things worse. The thing about Theo was that he did not come from money. His family lived in a small apartment on the rough side of town. The heating did not always work in winter. The refrigerator was often half empty. His father worked double shifts just to keep the lights on, and Theo understood the weight of that sacrifice even if they never talked about it. There was no extra cash for new clothes or fancy gadgets or music lessons like the other kids had. There was just survival. One day at a time. School was not a place where Theo felt like he belonged. The popular kids had their circles, the athletes had their teams, the music students had their programs, and their expensive instruments, and their private tutors. Theo had none of that. He was just the quiet boy who sat in the back corner and waited for the day to end. But here is the thing that nobody knew about Theo. Behind those tired eyes and that silent exterior, there was a fire burning. A passion that he kept hidden from the world, a secret that not a single person at Westbrook High could have ever guessed. It was a cold Tuesday afternoon in early March, when everything started to change. Theo was walking through the main hallway after his last class when he noticed a crowd gathered near the bulletin board. Students were pushing and talking excitedly, trying to get a closer look at something. Theo almost walked past without stopping. Crowds were not really his thing, but something made him pause. He waited until most of the students cleared out, then stepped closer to read the bright yellow flyer pinned to the board. It announced the annual Spring Talent Showcase, the biggest event of the school year. This was not just any talent show. College scouts attended. Local news covered it. Winners had gone on to receive scholarships and opportunities that changed their lives. It was a very big deal at Westbrook High. Theo stood there reading the details. Auditions were open to all students. Any type of talent was welcome. There would be judges from the music department and even some guests from outside the school. The winner would perform at the City Arts Festival and receive a $5,000 prize. For a moment, Theo let himself imagine what it would feel like to stand on that stage. His heart beat a little faster. His hands felt warm. But then reality came crashing back. Kids like him did not enter talent shows. Kids like him stayed invisible. He was about to walk away when a group of students from the music program stopped right next to him. They did not even notice he was there. That was how invisible he was. One of them, a tall boy with an expensive watch and perfectly styled hair, laughed loudly. This was Derek, the star pianist of Westbrook High. Everyone knew Derek. He had been playing piano since he was 5. He had private lessons with a famous teacher in the city. He had already been accepted to one of the best music schools in the country. Derek was the golden boy, and he knew it. Can you imagine if someone random tried out? Derek said to his friends. Like, imagine if the janitor's kid walked up there and tried to play something. His friends burst out laughing. He probably thinks a piano is something you eat, another one added. More laughter. Theo stood frozen. His face stayed completely blank. But inside, something twisted painfully in his chest. He was used to being ignored. He was used to being overlooked. But being mocked, even when they did not know he was listening, hit differently. Derek and his friends walked away, still laughing among themselves. They never once looked back. They never saw the quiet boy standing by the bulletin board with his jaw tight and his fists clenched at his sides. Theo took one last look at the flyer. Then he turned and walked out of the school without saying a word to anyone. The walk home took about 20 minutes. But Theo did not go home that day. Instead, he turned down a different street. He walked past the old grocery store that had closed years ago. He walked past the empty lot filled with weeds and broken glass. He kept walking until the houses got smaller and the streets got quieter, and the world seemed to fade away behind him. After about 3 miles, he reached the old church. It had been abandoned for over a decade. The windows were boarded up. The paint was peeling. The sign out front was so faded you could barely read the letters anymore. Most people in town avoided this place. They said it was dangerous, that the floors might collapse, that there was nothing inside worth seeing anyway. But Theo knew better. He slipped through a gap in the back fence, the same way he had done hundreds of times before. He pushed open the side door that never quite latched properly. And then he stepped inside. The air was cool and dusty. Pale light filtered through cracks in the boarded windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Old pews were pushed against the walls, covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling. The whole place smelled like old wood and forgotten time. But none of that mattered to Theo. Because in the center of that abandoned church, sitting on a raised platform like it had been waiting for him all along, was a grand piano. It was old and dusty. Some of the keys were chipped. The bench was worn and creaky. But to Theo, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. He walked toward it slowly, like he was greeting an old friend. He sat down on the bench and let his fingers rest on the keys. The familiar weight of them felt like coming home. This was his secret. This was the place he came every single day after school, while his father worked late shifts and the world forgot he existed. For 6 years, Theo had taught himself to play piano in this abandoned church. No teachers. No lessons. No expensive programs. Just him, this old piano, and an endless hunger to create something beautiful. He closed his eyes and began to play. The music filled the empty church. It bounced off the walls and floated up to the ceiling and wrapped around him like a warm blanket. In that moment, Theo was not invisible. In that moment, he was not the janitor's son, or the quiet kid, or the boy that nobody noticed. In that moment, he was exactly who he was meant to be. And somewhere deep inside, for the first time in a very long time, he started to believe that maybe the world deserved to hear what he had been hiding all along. The old church had become Theo's entire world. Every single day, no matter how tired he was or how bad things got at school, he made the 3-mile walk to that forgotten building on the edge of town. Rain or shine, summer or winter, he never missed a day. It was the only place where he felt like he could breathe. He had discovered the church by accident 6 years ago, back when he was just 11 years old. That was the year his mother passed away. She had been sick for a long time, and even though the doctors did everything they could, sometimes life just does not work out the way you hope. Theo remembered sitting beside her hospital bed in those final days, holding her hand while she told him stories about when she was young. His mother had loved music. She used to sing to him every night before bed. She would hum little melodies while she cooked dinner or folded laundry. And sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would sit at the old keyboard in their living room and play songs that made Theo feel like everything in the world was going to be okay. After she died, his father sold the keyboard. They needed the money for bills. Theo understood, but it broke something inside him. It felt like losing her all over again. For months after her death, Theo wandered. He could not focus at school. He could not sleep at night. He felt lost in a way that he did not have words for. His father was dealing with his own grief, working longer hours just to keep them afloat, and there was no money for therapy or counseling or any of the things that might have helped a grieving child. One afternoon, Theo walked farther than he had ever walked before. He did not have a destination in mind. He just needed to move, to get away from the emptiness of their small apartment. That was when he stumbled upon the old church. At first, he was just curious. The building looked spooky and abandoned, and something about it called to him. He found the gap in the fence, squeezed through, and pushed open the side door. The inside was dark and dusty, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. But then he saw it, sitting in the middle of the room like it had been waiting for him all along. The piano. Theo had never played a piano in his life. He did not know the first thing about music theory or scales or any of that stuff. But when he sat down on that creaky old bench and pressed his fingers to the keys, something happened. A single note rang out through the empty church, and for the first time since his mother died, Theo felt something other than sadness. He felt hope. From that day forward, the church became his sanctuary. He started teaching himself to play using whatever resources he could find. He watched tutorials on his phone using the free Wi-Fi at the public library. He checked out books on music theory and studied them until the pages were worn and wrinkled. He practiced for hours every single day, his fingers stumbling over the keys again and again until they finally started to remember where to go. The first year was brutal. His hands cramped constantly. His fingers bled from pressing the keys too hard. There were days when he wanted to give up, when the music just would not come and he felt like a fool for even trying. But every time he thought about quitting, he remembered his mother's voice. He remembered the way she used to hum those little melodies, and he kept going. By the second year, he could play simple songs. By the third year, he was tackling pieces that most beginners would never attempt. By the fourth year, he had moved on to classical compositions that took professional pianists years to master. And now, 6 years later, Theo could play things that would make conservatory students jealous. But nobody knew. His father had no idea where Theo disappeared to every afternoon. He assumed his son was at the library or wandering around town. They did not talk much these days. His father was always tired, always working, always carrying the weight of keeping their small family alive. Theo did not blame him. He understood. But it meant that his secret stayed hidden. At school, nobody would have believed it anyway. Theo was the quiet kid, the invisible one. The janitor's son, who wore old clothes and never raised his hand in class. The idea that he could sit down at a piano and play Chopin or Rachmaninoff or Liszt would have seemed like a joke to everyone who thought they knew him, and maybe that was part of why he kept it secret. The music was his. It was the one thing in his life that belonged only to him. Sharing it felt dangerous somehow, like exposing a wound that had never fully healed. But things were different now. Ever since that day by the bulletin board, Theo could not stop thinking about the talent show. He kept hearing Derek's voice in his head, mocking him, laughing about how someone like him could never belong on that stage. The words burned like fire. They made him angry in a way he had not felt in a long time. But underneath the anger, there was something else. A tiny voice whispering that maybe this was his chance. Maybe this was the moment he had been waiting for, without even knowing it. For days, Theo went back and forth. He would convince himself to sign up, then talk himself out of it. He would imagine standing on that stage, and his heart would race with excitement. Then he would imagine everyone laughing at him, and his stomach would twist with fear. One night, he sat alone in the church long after the sun had gone down. The moonlight crept through the cracks in the boarded windows, casting pale silver streaks across the old piano. Theo stared at the keys for a long time without playing. He thought about his mother. He thought about all the hours he had spent in this place, teaching himself to create something beautiful out of nothing. He thought about every time someone at school had looked right through him like he did not exist. And then he made a decision. The next morning, Theo walked into school earlier than usual. The hallways were mostly empty. He made his way to the music department office and found the stack of application forms sitting on the front desk. His hands were shaking as he picked one up. He filled it out quickly, before he could change his mind. Name, grade, type of talent. He hesitated on that last one, then wrote 2 words: piano performance. He slipped the form into the submission box and walked away without looking back. 2 days later, the music director found his application. Her name was Mrs. Patterson, and she had been running the Spring Talent Showcase for 15 years. She knew every student in the music program by name. She knew who had potential, and who was just going through the motions. She prided herself on discovering talent, but when she saw Theo's name on the form, she frowned. She did not recognize him. He was not in any of her classes. He was not in the choir or the band or the orchestra. He had never participated in a single music event in all his years at Westbrook High. She pulled up his student file on her computer. Janitor's son. No extracurricular activities. Average grades. Nothing special. Mrs. Patterson almost threw the application away. What was the point of letting some random kid embarrass himself on stage? The talent show had a reputation to protect. College scouts would be there. This was not the place for charity cases. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the neat handwriting on the form. Maybe it was the way he had written piano performance with such simple confidence. Or maybe it was just the rule she had made years ago and never broken. Everyone gets an audition. She sighed, added his name to the list, and moved on to the next application. She had no idea what she had just set in motion, and neither did Theo. Audition day arrived faster than Theo expected. One moment he was slipping that application into the box, and the next, he was staring at himself in the cracked bathroom mirror of his apartment, trying to figure out what to wear. He did not own anything nice. No suits, no dress shirts, nothing that looked like it belonged on a stage. He dug through his small closet and pulled out the cleanest thing he had. A plain white button-up shirt that his father had bought him 2 years ago for a distant relative's funeral. It was slightly too small now, tight around the shoulders, but it was the best he could do. He paired it with his least faded jeans and his only pair of shoes that did not have holes in them. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he did not see a performer. He saw a kid pretending to be something he was not. For a moment, he considered not going. He could just skip it. Nobody would care. Nobody would even notice. He could go back to being invisible, back to his secret church and his hidden music, and nothing would change. But then he thought about Derek's voice. That mocking laugh. The way those kids had talked about him like he was nothing. Theo grabbed his backpack and walked out the door. The auditions were scheduled for 3 o'clock in the main auditorium. When Theo arrived at school that morning, he could barely focus on anything. His teachers' voices sounded far away, like they were speaking underwater. His notes were messy and incomplete. All he could think about was what was coming. By the time the final bell rang, his stomach was in knots. He made his way to the auditorium slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway outside was already crowded with students. Some were warming up their voices, others were stretching or practicing dance moves. A few had instruments in cases, polished and gleaming. Theo had nothing. No instrument, no sheet music, just himself and whatever was inside him. He pushed through the doors and stepped into the auditorium. The room was bigger than he remembered. Rows and rows of red velvet seats stretched toward the back. The stage at the front was lit with bright lights that made everything look sharp and exposed. A grand piano sat off to one side, sleek and black and beautiful. Theo's heart jumped when he saw it, but then he noticed the people. There were at least 30 students already seated in the first few rows, waiting for their turn to audition. Teachers and faculty members sat at a long table near the front. Clipboards and papers spread out before them. Mrs. Patterson was in the center, her glasses perched on her nose, her expression serious and focused. And there, sitting in the front row like he owned the place, was Derek. He was surrounded by his usual group of friends, all of them laughing about something. Derek had that easy confidence that came from never having to doubt himself. He was wearing an expensive blazer and a crisp white shirt that probably cost more than Theo's entire wardrobe. His hair was perfectly styled. His smile was perfectly practiced. Theo slipped into a seat near the back and tried to make himself small. The auditions began. One by one, students took the stage and performed. There were singers with powerful voices that filled the room. There were dancers who moved like they were made of water. There was a violinist who played with such precision that even Mrs. Patterson nodded in approval. Derek went somewhere in the middle. He walked to the piano with the kind of ease that only comes from years of expensive training. He adjusted the bench, cracked his knuckles, and launched into a complicated classical piece that Theo recognized immediately. It was technically perfect. Every note was clean. Every rhythm was exact. When Derek finished, the room burst into applause. His friends cheered loudly. Mrs. Patterson wrote something on her clipboard with a small smile. Derek stood, took a bow, and walked back to his seat like a king returning to his throne. Theo felt his confidence shrink a little more. The auditions continued. The list grew shorter. And then, finally, Mrs. Patterson looked down at her clipboard and called out a name. Theo. Just his name. Nothing else. No last name, no introduction. Just a single word that hung in the air like a question. For a second, Theo did not move. His legs felt frozen. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Every eye in the room turned toward the back, searching for whoever belonged to that name. He stood up slowly. The whispers started immediately. Who is that? I have no idea. Wait, is that the janitor's kid? What is he doing here? Theo walked down the aisle toward the stage. Each step felt like a mile. He could feel everyone staring at him, judging him, sizing him up. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to look at anyone. When he passed Derek's row, he heard a snort of laughter. Oh, this is going to be good, Derek muttered to his friends, just loud enough for Theo to hear. Someone pulled out a phone. Then another. Suddenly, several students were recording, their screens glowing in the dim auditorium. They were waiting for him to fail. They were waiting to capture it and share it and laugh about it later. Theo climbed the steps to the stage. The lights were blinding. The piano seemed impossibly far away. He walked toward it, his worn shoes making soft sounds on the wooden floor. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat. Theo, is it? He nodded. She looked at him over her glasses, her expression somewhere between confusion and concern. I do not see you in any of our music programs. Do you have any formal training? No, ma'am. More whispers from the audience. More muffled laughter. Mrs. Patterson glanced at her colleagues, then back at Theo. And, what will you be performing for us today? Theo's voice came out quieter than he intended. La Campanella. By Liszt. The room went silent. Even Derek stopped smirking. La Campanella was one of the most difficult piano pieces ever written. Professional pianists spent years mastering it. Conservatory students feared it. The idea that some random kid with no training was about to attempt it seemed almost absurd. Mrs. Patterson blinked. Are you sure? That is a very challenging piece. Perhaps something simpler would be more appropriate for. I am sure, Theo said. There was a moment of awkward silence. Mrs. Patterson exchanged a look with the teacher beside her, then sighed and gestured toward the piano. Very well, whenever you are ready. Theo walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. It was smoother than the one at his church. The keys were cleaner, shinier, perfectly maintained. He placed his hands on them gently, feeling their weight beneath his fingers. His heart was racing. His palms were sweating. He could hear the whispers behind him, the shifting of bodies in seats, the quiet snickers waiting to explode into full laughter. Derek had his phone out again, angled directly at the stage. His friends were grinning beside him, ready to witness what they assumed would be the most embarrassing moment of the year. Theo closed his eyes. He thought about his mother. He thought about her voice, her songs, the way she used to hum while she worked. He thought about the old church and the dusty piano and the 6 years he had spent teaching himself to play in secret. He thought about every night his fingers had bled, every time he wanted to quit, every moment he had pushed through the pain because the music was all he had. He thought about being invisible, about being laughed at, about being told, without words, that he would never be good enough. And then, in the silence of that auditorium, with dozens of eyes watching and dozens of phones recording and an entire world waiting for him to fail, Theo took a breath. He opened his eyes, and he began to play. The first note cut through the silence like a blade. It was soft, delicate. A single sound that floated up from the piano and hung in the air for just a moment before fading away. Most people in the audience did not even react. They were still waiting for the disaster, still waiting for the awkward stumble, the wrong key, the embarrassing proof that this nobody kid had no business being on that stage. But then came the second note, and the third, and the fourth. Theo's fingers began to move across the keys. Slowly at first, like a river just starting to flow. The opening melody of La Campanella filled the auditorium, light and shimmering, each note ringing out like a tiny bell. It was the sound of something fragile and beautiful being born. In the front row, Derek's smirk began to fade. The thing about La Campanella is that it starts gently. It lulls you into thinking it might be simple. But anyone who knows the piece understands that it builds. It grows. It transforms into something that most pianists can only dream of playing. And Theo knew the piece better than anyone in that room could have imagined. His fingers picked up speed. The notes came faster now, tumbling over each other like water rushing over rocks. His hands stretched across the keys, hitting intervals that seemed impossibly wide. The melody danced and leaped, climbing higher and higher with each phrase. Mrs. Patterson's clipboard slipped from her hands. It clattered to the floor, but she did not pick it up. She did not even look down. Her eyes were locked on the boy at the piano, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. The whispers in the audience had stopped completely. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was recording for jokes. Every single person in that auditorium was frozen, caught in the grip of something they had not expected. Theo played like he was alone. Like there was no audience, no judges, no Derek, no one watching at all. He played the way he had played in the old church for 6 years, with his eyes closed and his heart wide open. The music poured out of him like it had been trapped inside for too long and was finally being set free. His right hand flew across the upper keys, executing runs and trills that would make conservatory students weep. His left hand anchored the bass, steady and strong, providing a foundation for the fireworks happening above. The two hands worked together in perfect harmony, creating something that seemed almost impossible for a single person to produce. But it was not just the technical skill that stunned the room. Plenty of pianists could play the notes. What made Theo different was the emotion behind them. There was grief in his music. You could hear it in the way certain phrases lingered just a moment longer than expected. Like someone holding on to a memory they did not want to let go. There was loneliness in the quiet passages, a deep aching sadness that seemed to reach out and touch everyone who listened. But there was also hope. It came through in the bright, soaring sections where the melody climbed toward the sky. It sparkled in the fast runs that sounded like laughter, like joy, like the feeling of finally being seen after years of being invisible. Theo was not just playing a piece of music, he was telling his story. Every note was a word. Every phrase was a sentence. And the story he told was one of loss and pain and survival and the stubborn refusal to give up, even when the whole world seemed determined to keep him down. In the middle of the audience, a teacher wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She had taught at Westbrook for 20 years and thought she had seen everything. But she had never seen anything like this. Near the back, a freshman who had come to watch his sister audition sat with his jaw hanging open. He had never cared much about classical music before. It always seemed boring and old-fashioned. But this was different. This was alive. Derek sat motionless in his seat. His phone had lowered to his lap without him even realizing it. The screen had gone dark. He was not recording anymore. He was just watching, his face pale, his eyes wide. For the first time in his life, Derek understood what it felt like to witness something truly extraordinary. The piece built toward its climax. Theo's hands moved so fast they seemed to blur. The notes cascaded down like a waterfall, then surged back up like a wave crashing against the shore. The dynamics swelled from soft to thundering, filling the auditorium with a sound so big it seemed impossible that it was coming from just one person. Sweat dripped down Theo's forehead. His shoulders were tense. Every muscle in his body was focused on the music. This was the hardest part of the piece. The section where most pianists stumbled or slowed down or simply gave up. But Theo did not slow down. He pushed forward, his fingers flying, his heart pounding, everything he had pouring into the keys beneath his hands. The final passage arrived like a storm breaking. The notes came faster and faster, building to an almost unbearable intensity. And then, with one last magnificent run that spanned the entire keyboard, Theo brought his hands down for the final chord. The sound rang out through the auditorium. Rich and full and powerful. It hung in the air for a long moment, vibrating in the chests of everyone who heard it, and then there was silence. Complete, absolute silence. Theo sat at the piano with his hands still resting on the keys. His eyes were closed. His chest was heaving. He did not move. He did not look up. He just sat there, breathing, feeling the last echoes of the music fade away. For 3 long seconds, nobody made a sound. The silence was so heavy it felt like the whole world had stopped spinning. And then it broke. One person started clapping. Then another. Then 10 more. Within moments, the entire auditorium erupted into applause. It was not polite clapping. It was not the kind of applause you give because you are supposed to. It was real. It was loud. It was the sound of people who had just witnessed something they would never forget. Students rose to their feet. Teachers stood up from their chairs. The applause grew into a roar, filling every corner of the room. Someone shouted. Someone else whistled. The noise built and built until it felt like the walls themselves were shaking. Mrs. Patterson stood behind her table, clapping so hard her hands hurt. Tears were streaming down her face, and she did not care who saw them. In 15 years of running this talent show, she had never experienced anything like this. She had almost thrown away this boy's application. She had almost denied him his chance. The thought made her chest tight with something that felt like shame and wonder mixed together. Theo finally opened his eyes. He looked out at the audience and saw something he had never seen before. People were looking at him. Really looking at him. Not through him. Not past him. At him. Their faces were full of shock and amazement and respect. For the first time in his life, Theo was not invisible. He did not know what to do. He had imagined this moment so many times, but the reality of it was overwhelming. His legs felt weak. His hands were trembling. He stood up slowly from the bench, almost stumbling as he rose. The applause continued. It showed no signs of stopping. Near the front, Derek sat completely still. He was not clapping. He was not moving. He just stared at the stage with an expression that was impossible to read. Something had shifted behind his eyes. Something had cracked. Theo walked toward the edge of the stage on shaky legs. He did not take a bow. He did not wave or smile. He just walked, one foot in front of the other, until he reached the stairs and descended back into the crowd. As he passed Derek's row, their eyes met for just a moment. Derek opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Theo looked away and kept walking. He made it to the back of the auditorium and pushed through the doors into the empty hallway beyond. The sound of applause was muffled now, distant, like a dream he was slowly waking up from. He leaned against the wall and let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. His hands were still shaking. His heart was still racing. But somewhere deep inside, in a place that had been cold and dark for a very long time, something warm was beginning to glow. He had done it, and nothing would ever be the same again. The news spread through Westbrook High like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew the story. The quiet kid, the janitor's son, the boy who came out of nowhere and played piano like nobody had ever heard before. Students who had never spoken a single word to Theo suddenly knew his name. Teachers who had barely noticed him were now whispering about him in the staff room. Everything had changed overnight. Theo did not just make it into the spring talent showcase. Mrs. Patterson called him personally that evening to tell him he would be the closing act, the final performer of the night, the spot that was always reserved for the best. When she told him, Theo had to sit down. His legs would not hold him anymore. The weeks leading up to the showcase passed in a blur. Theo continued his daily walks to the old church, but now the practice felt different. Before, he had played for himself, for his mother, for the silence. Now, he was playing for something bigger. He was playing for a chance. Mrs. Patterson offered him access to the school's practice rooms, but Theo politely declined. He did not feel comfortable in those polished spaces with their bright lights and perfect acoustics. The old church was where he belonged. It was where his music lived. He did not tell his father about any of it. He wanted to, but the words never came. His father worked so hard. He came home exhausted every night, barely able to stay awake through dinner. Theo did not want to add to his worries, and part of him was scared that if he said it out loud, it would somehow fall apart. The night of the showcase arrived on a Friday in late April. The auditorium was transformed. Red velvet curtains hung from the ceiling. Professional lights lined the stage. Rows of seats stretched back farther than Theo could see, and every single one of them was filled. Parents, students, teachers, and guests packed the room. Near the front, a small group of people in formal clothes sat with notepads and serious expressions. College scouts, the people who could change a life with a single word. Backstage, Theo stood alone in a corner, trying to control his breathing. He was wearing a borrowed suit jacket that Mrs. Patterson had found for him. It was slightly too big, but it was better than anything he owned. His hands were cold, his mouth was dry. He could hear the muffled sounds of performers taking the stage one by one. Each act met with applause that seemed impossibly loud. He tried not to think about how many people were out there. He tried not to think about what would happen if he messed up. He tried to focus on the music, on the notes, on the feeling of the keys beneath his fingers. The hours crawled by. Act after act finished and left the stage. Singers, dancers. A comedian who made the whole audience laugh. A group of drummers who shook the floor. Each performance was impressive in its own way, but Theo barely heard any of them. His mind was somewhere else entirely. Finally, a stagehand approached him with a headset pressed to her ear. "You are up next," she said. 2 minutes. Theo nodded. He could not speak. He walked toward the wings of the stage and stood in the shadows, waiting. The current act finished. The applause rose and fell. And then he heard Mrs. Patterson's voice over the speakers, introducing the final performance of the night. She talked about talent and hard work. She talked about surprises and discovering something extraordinary in unexpected places. She talked about a young man who had taught himself to play piano in secret for 6 years. The audience murmured with curiosity, and then she said his name. Theo stepped out onto the stage. The lights hit him immediately, bright and blinding. He squinted against them as he walked toward the grand piano at the center of the stage. The audience was a sea of shadows beyond the glare, thousands of eyes watching his every move. His heart hammered against his ribs. He sat down at the bench. The piano gleamed under the lights, beautiful and waiting. He placed his hands on the keys and let himself breathe, but before he played, he did something he had not planned to do. He leaned toward the microphone that had been set up nearby and spoke. "This is for my mother," he said quietly. "She taught me that music can heal anything. I hope she is listening." His voice cracked on the last word. But he did not care. He turned back to the piano, closed his eyes, and began to play. The piece he had chosen was not La Campanella. It was something else entirely. Something he had written himself over the past 6 years, adding to it little by little, note by note, until it became a complete story. His story, a journey from grief to hope, from silence to sound, from invisible to seen. The music filled the auditorium. It was soft at first, delicate and sad, like the memory of someone who was no longer there. Then it grew, building slowly, adding layers of complexity and emotion. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes crashing, sometimes gentle. It spoke of pain and loneliness, of cold nights and empty rooms, but it also spoke of strength, of survival, of love that never really dies. In the audience, something remarkable was happening. People were crying. Not just a few people, dozens of them. Mothers held their hands over their hearts. Fathers blinked hard and looked away. Students who had never cared about classical music sat motionless, caught in the grip of something they could not explain. Near the back of the auditorium, standing against the wall because he had arrived too late to find a seat, was a man in a worn work jacket. His hands were rough from years of labor. His face was tired. But his eyes were fixed on the stage, and tears were streaming down his cheeks. It was Theo's father. He had found out about the showcase by accident. A teacher had mentioned it to him while he was cleaning the hallway after school. At first, he had not believed it. His son? Performing in the talent show? Playing piano? It seemed impossible. But the teacher had insisted, and something in her voice made him decide to come and see for himself. Now he stood in the back of that crowded auditorium, watching his son play music so beautiful it made his chest ache. He thought about all the afternoons Theo had disappeared, all the times he had wondered where his boy went, all the conversations they never had because he was too tired, too busy, too lost in his own grief to notice what was happening right in front of him. His son had been carrying this gift in secret for 6 years, and he had never known. On stage, Theo played the final notes of his composition. The music swelled one last time, reaching towards something bright and hopeful, and then slowly faded into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the auditorium exploded. The applause was deafening. People leaped to their feet. The standing ovation spread across the room like a wave, row after row rising to their feet. The noise went on and on, filling every corner of the space. Theo stood from the bench on shaky legs. He looked out at the crowd, overwhelmed, unable to process what was happening. And then, through the lights and the noise and the sea of faces, he saw him, his father, standing in the back, crying and clapping harder than anyone else. Their eyes met across the crowded room. No words were needed. In that single look, everything was understood. The secrets, the silence, the years of quiet struggle, and beneath all of it, a love that had always been there, even when they did not know how to show it. After the show, a woman in an elegant dress approached Theo backstage. She introduced herself as a representative from one of the top music conservatories in the country. She had been watching from the third row. She told him that in 20 years of scouting talent, she had never heard anyone play with such raw emotion and technical brilliance. She offered him a full scholarship on the spot. Theo could barely hear her words. The world felt like a dream he was afraid to wake up from. Later that night, after the crowds had left and the auditorium had gone dark, Theo and his father sat together on the front steps of the school. The air was cool. The stars were out. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, his father broke the silence. "Why did you never tell me?" Theo looked down at his hands. The same hands that had bled on those old piano keys. The same hands that had built something beautiful out of nothing. "I did not know how," he said quietly. "I was not sure you would understand." His father put an arm around his shoulder and pulled him close. "I understand now," he said. "And I am so proud of you. Your mother would be too." Theo leaned into his father's embrace, and for the first time in 6 years, he let himself cry. Not from sadness, from relief, from joy, from the feeling of finally being known. He had spent his whole life being invisible, but he was not invisible anymore. And somewhere, he knew, his mother was listening. She had heard every note.